Isabella was a well-known designer. She created simple yet elegant dresses for affluent ladies, investing all her time and energy into her work. At 35, she lived alone in a spacious studio apartment. Her furniture consisted only of a comfortable wide bed and a small table where she enjoyed coffee and croissants in the mornings. The rest of the space was occupied by a large table where she laid out fabric samples and her beloved sewing machine, Isabella's faithful companion. It was nearly her only companion, as she had little time for socializing due to the abundance of clothing orders from various well-known brands. Isabella never had a family. Although once she almost got married. She sighed and set aside the folder of samples. Her studio was located in the attic of a tall building in an elite district of the city. The windows were uncovered to let in maximum light during the day. Isabella stood up, tied the belt of her crisp white silk robe, and walked to the window. Beyond the glass, the evening city sparkled with golden lights. Further away, the bay gleamed, with lanterns lining the main promenade like shimmering beads. Isabella sighed. During the day, she didn't feel her loneliness. She was absorbed in seeking new ideas, sketching, dealing with work matters, contacting clients, and selecting fabrics. Work had always been her joy, making Isabella feel alive and full of energy. Even routine didn't bore her. Years of experience taught her when to set one task aside and switch to another. But evenings brought a different feeling over Isabella. The glittering city at her feet made her acutely aware of her solitude. Completely alone. Isabella felt like an invisible comet flying through a forgotten cosmic space, with no one in the world capable of warming her frozen heart. She sighed again and shifted her gaze from the distant city to her reflection in the glass. Dark curly locks framed her face. Round reading glasses suited her well. Bright blue eyes, inherited from her mother. Barely noticeable crow's feet around her eyes. Isabella was still as beautiful as she was in her youth. Many were surprised when they heard her age. They wouldn't guess she was older than 28. However, she believed people flattered her. Looking into the reflection of her eyes, Isabella saw the imprint of years of loneliness. Deep down, she felt like an ancient crone. At first, Isabella tried to fight this feeling. She would wear a long black dress and wander along brightly lit, expensive storefronts, or drop into a noisy bar and order lemonade. She would sit for a long time, listening to the voices of local singers, remembering how she used to stroll with Javier. Her fiancé adored live music, and they often went to bars to listen to it. Isabella remembered his lively face, his chestnut eyes filled with love and tenderness. Approached her to introduce themselves, but each time she only shook her head in response. Then she would walk home with an even greater emptiness inside. At some point, these walks became so unbearable that Isabella stopped going out in the evenings altogether. She worked late into the night and then watched black and white movies, read, or mindlessly doodled lines in her sketchbook. Isabella ran her hand through her hair to brush away the memories. Turning away from the window, she glanced at the wall clock, a gift from a familiar designer, Hugo Martinez. Black and white dial, designed in a strict style. The clock showed 10 minutes to 10. So, they would call her again soon. It all started about 7 years ago, a few months after Isabella's failed wedding. She still couldn't recover, cried bitterly every day, but the tears never ceased. The girl mourned for Javier, who unexpectedly disappeared on the very day they were supposed to get married. Isabella was taken in by her older sister Mercedes. She and her husband helped her both morally and financially. Isabella spent the whole day lying in a small room under the roof, staring blankly at the floral pattern of the old wallpaper. That's when it first happened. Night was approaching, the room was dark, but the girl didn't want to turn on the light. She lay there, staring into the darkness with unseeing eyes, while disjointed images from the past flashed and immediately faded in her memory. She remembered those moments when she and Javier laughed until they cried, when they spent endless nights discussing their dreams and plans for the future. Every moment was etched in her memory: the first date in a cozy cafe, when he was nervous, trying to make an impression, long walks in the park, holding hands and exchanging tender words, evenings by the fireplace, when time stood still, and only the two of them existed in this world. She remembered his promises of love and devotion, his tender words and affectionate touches. But where were those promises now? Where was this love that was supposed to last forever? It was then, dying of grief, that the chime of the old family clock in the living room reached Isabella. The clock struck 10. At the same moment, the room was illuminated by a cold, bluish-white light. Her mobile screen lit up. Isabella indifferently turned her head and looked at the display. An incoming call in silent mode. Isabella constantly turned off the sound because she had no desire whatsoever to talk to anyone, to listen to how sorry they felt for her, and to hear assurances that time would heal all wounds. The call came from an unknown number. Isabella stared at the numbers for a long time. The number ended in 49. By some absurd coincidence, those numbers meant so much to her and Javier. 49, San Martin Street. That was the address of the house they bought shortly before the failed wedding. A tear quietly rolled down Isabella's cheek. The call ended, but a moment later the same numbers lit up on the display. Someone persistently wanted to reach her. Isabella, unconsciously, reached for her mobile phone. "Hello," she answered quietly, feeling her heart pounding. However, the only response she got was silence. The next evening, exactly at 10, the same thing happened again. The call came from a different number, but the digits 49 were still present. Isabella pressed the answer button, but once again, there was silence on the other end. She thought she could hear faint, intermittent breathing, but she wasn't entirely sure. Since then, every day at exactly 10 o'clock, she received a call on her mobile from an unknown number, and each time, there was only ringing silence on the other end. Isabella told her sister about the calls, and she advised her to contact the police. However, Isabella didn't do it. She didn't know why, but these daily calls calmed her and filled her with a glimmer of hope. 7 years had passed since then. Isabella had become a well-known designer, living in the heart of a big city, but she continued to wait for the call from the unknown number with the digits 49 every day. She felt like the universe was sending her support and love in this strange way. And today, exactly at 10 o'clock, the phone rang again. Isabella instinctively brought the mobile phone to her ear and listened to the symbolic silence for a minute. "Good night to you too," Isabella thought to herself and pressed the end call button. She was about to put the phone on the bedside table and go to sleep when it vibrated again in her hand. This time, the number was quite familiar. Hugo's name appeared on the display. They had worked together on a collection about 5 years ago. It was then that he gave her the watch. Isabella knew that Hugo had long loved her, but she always refused his invitations, insisting on purely professional relationships. "It's strange that he's calling so late," Isabella thought as she pressed the green button. "Belle, darling, how are you?" came Hugo's friendly voice through the phone. "Hugo, dear, I'm fine. Why are you calling so late?" Isabella asked. "Don't worry, I'm not calling to ask you out on a date." Hugo chuckled, relieving Isabella's heart. It was always awkward for her to turn down Hugo. He was a wonderful person and a great friend who had supported her on her path to professional success. But she couldn't help it. For her, Hugo was and always would be just a friend. "Just listen to what I have to say," Hugo exclaimed. "My manager just called. We're invited to a grand business conference in the capital. Everyone will be there. You understand, everyone. Such an opportunity comes once in a decade. It's an excellent chance to promote our new collections, attract prestigious clients, and enter the international market." "Isabella? I don't hear any applause in our honor." Isabella has truly lost the gift of speech. "Hugo, I don't even know what to say. What if I can't handle it?" There was a dissatisfied grumble on the other end of the line. "How can you not handle it? You're a professional. Where else would we find someone like you?" You'll nail the collection presentation. It'll be a piece of cake. I have no doubt in you. Isabella gratefully smiled. Hugo always knew how to support her. But how did you manage to do it? She asked. For Hugo Martinez, nothing is impossible, chuckled the old friend and wished Isabella a good night. She lay in bed, but of course, sleep eluded her. She had long dreamed of being recognized in Europe, but she never thought Hugo would be able to make it happen. The following weeks were spent in active preparation. There was much to do. At the time of Hugo's call, the collection was still in the sketch stage, so Isabella had to quickly find fabric samples, make purchases, and sew models. By the beginning of May, everything was ready, leaving only the polishing of the presentation, with which Isabella planned to address wealthy compatriots and European businessmen. Hugo sent the tickets by email. Isabella pondered for a long time what to wear to the conference, deciding that the outfit should be in strict tones, but contain some bold and memorable element. Why don't you wear a hat? Hugo suggested over the phone, and an image immediately flashed in Isabella's mind, a light-fitting trousers suit, concealing a slightly protruding belly, with a thin mesh turtleneck underneath. And on her head, a huge pink hat and matching candy-colored shoes. Hugo approved the image. He himself decided to appear at the conference in a mint-colored shirt, which emphasized his bronze tan, light trousers, and a vest. We definitely won't go unnoticed, Hugo chuckled into the phone, and Isabella agreed with him. The flight lasted an hour. Hugo and Isabella sat in different parts of the plane. The designer dozed off, while the woman reviewed the materials for the presentation once again. She was very nervous, feeling her palms sweat distinctly. Much depended on this conference, her prospects, the opportunity to fulfill a long-standing dream. But the woman couldn't even imagine how significant this business meeting would become for her. She remembered how yesterday exactly at 10 p.m. the phone rang once again. Isabella picked up the receiver and, unexpectedly even for herself, quickly said, "Tomorrow my dream will come true." For a moment, she thought she would finally get a response. But no, the line remained silent, yet Isabella felt as if she heard a silent sigh. Before landing, Isabella drifted off to sleep for about 10 minutes, and she had a strange dream. She was walking down the street in a pink hat, the sun shining brightly. Suddenly, Isabella remembered about the conference. I urgently need to call Hugo, she thought. She searched her purse for her phone, but it wasn't there. Isabella's forehead beaded with sweat. Suddenly, a hurricane wind rushed in, snatching her hat off her head and carrying it out of sight in an instant. Isabella was in despair. The street was rapidly growing dark. People were moving in different directions, while she stood bewildered in place. Suddenly, Isabella heard the tolling of a bell, exactly 10 strikes. She clutched her head. She had never missed a call from an unknown number before. Ahead, she noticed a red telephone booth and hurried towards it. Someone was there. Isabella tapped on the glass, and the person turned around. She screamed and covered her mouth with her hand because it was Javier. Isabella abruptly opened her eyes as the plane began its descent. It took her some time to shake off the feeling the dream had been so vivid that she felt unsettled. Javier rarely appeared in her dreams, and when he did, he was always a vague silhouette. When the plane landed, Isabella was still in the grip of the dream she had seen. You look so pale, Belle. Did you have a rough flight? Hugo asked, looking at her with concern. I'm fine, Hugo, it'll pass soon, she replied. Hugo retrieved their luggage and called a taxi. Isabella silently thanked him for taking care of everything. She still felt unwell, her body was trembling, her hands shaking. Arriving at the hotel, Hugo checked them in at the reception and called the elevator. Seeing Isabella to her room, he wished her a good night. You need to rest well, Belle. Tomorrow is an important day for us. We'll show them who knows fashion and style the best. But for now, sleep, sleep, sleep. Isabella weakly smiled and entered her room. It was almost 10:15 on the clock. She quickly showered and lay down, snug under the white fluffy blanket. At 10 o'clock, the phone was silent. Isabella waited for 5 minutes, then 10, then half an hour. No one called. Closer to midnight, she burst into tears. It was the first time in 7 years. "Where are you?" Isabella whispered in despair. In the morning, a worried Hugo woke her up. "Belle, are you still asleep? The conference starts in 40 minutes. Isabella hurriedly began to get ready. She concealed the dark circles under her eyes with a thick layer of foundation cream. Fortunately, the hat hid the slight mess on her head. The light suit fit her perfectly. Isabella descended to the lobby, holding a light folder with materials, and Hugo breathed a sigh of relief. "Thank God, you're on time." "You look great as always, just a little tired," he said. "I slept very poorly," explained Isabella. "I understand," Hugo replied. "I've called a taxi." They got into the car, which quickly brought them to a huge skyscraper with blue windows. "The conference will be here, on the 13th floor," muttered Hugo, consulting a handwritten note in his notebook. "Conference room number 49. Isabella froze in place. Hugo shook his head disapprovingly but didn't say anything. They called the elevator and ascended to the hall. A considerable crowd had already gathered. There were renowned designers, distinguished fashion connoisseurs, and entrepreneurs from all over the world. Hugo and Isabella took their seats at the front of the room among the conference participants. For a moment, Isabella became distracted and forgot about everything. She was about to speak in front of all these people. She took out the presentation script from her folder and immersed herself in it. There was still a lingering unease in her soul, but Isabella forced herself to focus on her speech. The hall gradually filled with new people, but Isabella didn't notice. She only glanced up from the text once to make sure that the rail with samples of her collection was by the stage. Instantly, she recognized the bright green feathers on the dresses and the golden shimmer of sequins on the jackets. Tears welled up in her eyes for a moment. 7 years ago, she wore a radiant golden dress as she rode to the church where she was to marry Javier. Isabella had refused to wear the traditional white wedding dress for anything. Only gold, she had decided. It was audacious and bold for her hometown, but she didn't care. She only thought about Javier, eager to become his wife. A luxurious wedding limousine, a sea of flowers, a happy father, and the bridesmaids in their finery. Laughter and congratulations echoed everywhere. "This is the happiest day of my life," Isabella had thought then. How cruelly wrong she was. Hugo squeezed her elbow, breaking her out of the grip of memories. "Belle, you're next," he whispered, and the woman nodded. She took a deep breath, and upon hearing her name, amidst applause, she stepped onto the low stage. Camera shutters clicked everywhere, camera flashes blinded her. Isabella gathered herself, scanned the room, and was about to start her presentation when something caught her attention. In that moment, her heart pounded desperately in her chest, her head spun. But what made her so flustered? Isabella scanned the audience once more and met the intense gaze of someone's brown eyes. Such a gaze belonged to only one person familiar to her, and he was the dearest in her life. The woman was transported back 7 years. The limousine had stopped at the church, the door opened, and Isabella stepped out of the car in her luxurious golden dress. Her sister adjusted her hair, neatly arranging the train behind her back. Isabella took in a deep breath of the warm, transparent air and walked slowly toward the steps. She knew Javier was already there, waiting for her at the altar. Her father caught up with her and took her arm. Together, they ascended the wide staircase and stopped at the tall doors. Her father blessed her and kissed her forehead. The doors swung open. The rest was like a blur. Isabella entered the hall arm in arm with her father. All faces turned toward her, but there was no hint of a smile or joy. Confused, empty stares. "What's wrong with them?" flashed through Isabella's mind. "They look like they've come to a funeral." And then she heard someone crying. Sitting on the bench closest to the altar was Javier's mother, her shoulders shaking. Everything else Isabella remembered very vaguely. She was told Javier had gone missing, not answering calls, then his phone was turned off completely. Isabella couldn't believe he would leave her. As it turned out, it would have been better if he had. A week later, they reported finding his bloated body in a lake near the city. His relatives couldn't recognize Javier, but the examination proved it was him. All Isabella could remember from those dreadful days were the patterns on the wallpaper. It was then that she started designing dresses. Only that helped her from going insane. And now she stood before 100 people waiting for the performance to begin, but all she saw were the eyes of her long-lost loved ones. Isabella willed herself back to the present. "Come on, Belle," she heard Hugo whisper. Her dream was on the line, so Isabella took a deep breath and started her performance. However, her gaze, despite her will, began to wander around the room again. She noticed the man, the owner of those same eyes, was part of a foreign delegation. In his dark wavy hair, Isabella noticed a touch of gray. Seeing the woman looking at him, the man stood up and quickly made his way to the exit. "He's going to leave now." Isabella panicked. She stumbled and, swaying, dropped the presentation sheet from her hands. There was a commotion in the front row. Hugo was making his way to the stage to help her. Isabella helplessly looked at him, then shifted her gaze to the man, afraid he would disappear. Hugo stepped onto the stage and took her by the elbow. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly. "There," Isabella replied and fell silent. Her throat felt dry. "Can you continue the presentation?" Hugo asked. But Isabella didn't hear him. She was looking past his shoulder at the man who was already opening the door, intending to leave the hall. "Wait!" Isabella shouted and rushed to the exit. Hugo said something quickly after her, but she didn't hear him. She didn't see the hundreds of astonished eyes fixed on her. Her pink hat fell off her head and onto the floor, but Isabella paid no attention. The man exited the hall. "I have to catch up with him," Isabella thought frantically. "He can't be Javier, no, but still, I have to make sure." The man stood by the elevator. The doors opened, and he stepped inside. Isabella followed him, managing to slip into the elevator at the last moment. The man looked down, carefully avoiding her gaze. "I'm sorry," Isabella whispered. "I must seem crazy, but you look so much like someone dear to me. He who passed away 7 years ago." The man lifted his eyes and looked at her. Isabella's heart froze. She could swear it was Javier standing before her. The same tenderness and love shone in his eyes, but now mixed with guilt. "Belle," the man hoarsely whispered. "How I've missed you." With those words, he tightly embraced her. "Where have you been all this time? Why did you leave me?" Isabella whispered through tears, trembling as she clung to him. "I'll tell you everything," Javier replied softly, running his hand through her hair. The elevator doors opened. "Follow me," Javier whispered. "I have a car around the corner." The woman nodded, and they quickly headed towards the exit. On the street, Javier led her to an expensive black car and opened the door for her. Isabella sat in the passenger seat, Javier behind the wheel, and they set off. It still felt like a dream to Isabella. Javier's hands on the wheel, his wrists covered in dark hair, everything seemed unreal. "I saw you in a dream on the plane," Isabella sighed. Nothing else came to her mind. "I saw you in a dream every day throughout all these years," Javier confessed quietly. He parked in a narrow alley and turned to Isabella. "Forgive me, Belle. I couldn't do otherwise." Isabella looked at him, bewildered. "I never told you, but, in my youth, I got involved with a criminal group. I wanted easy money," Javier said bitterly. Isabella gasped. "But meeting you changed everything. I was so afraid you'd leave me if you found out the truth. So, I decided to break away from the past," Javier continued. Numerous questions raced through Isabella's mind, but she forced herself to listen carefully. "At first, I thought I had succeeded. They didn't demand anything. But a week before the wedding, they came to me with the intention of giving me a task that I really didn't want to do. I knew they wouldn't let it go. Remember when you were going to the store for the wedding cake and I told you to take my Jeep? They did something to the brakes in your car. That's why I was very careful and checked everything. I called a mechanic, and while he was fixing the brakes, a plan matured in my head. Isabella leaned forward. She began to suspect something, but Javier took her hand, asking her not to interrupt him. You see, I couldn't put you in danger, Belle. So, I came up with staging my own death. Unable to hold back, Isabella burst into tears. But how could you, Javier? How could you? I almost died of grief when I found out you had drowned. I almost went crazy. And all these years. Why did you leave me for so long? Why didn't you get in touch? It would have been enough just to hear from you. All this time I had to hide. You can't imagine how dangerous they are, Belle. Yes, I was afraid for myself, but most of all, for you. And I called you every evening. Isabella was thunderstruck. So it was you? She sighed. Javier gently stroked her cheek and nodded. I thought about you every minute of every hour of every day of mine. I missed you so much, my love. Isabella nestled against him. Me too. But why didn't you call yesterday? I was on a plane, Javier simply replied. And I knew that tomorrow I would finally see you. Isabella moved away from Javier and looked into his eyes. But why did you leave? All these years I've been following your success. When I found out you were going to participate in the biggest business conference, I suggested to my company to become your investor. I really wanted your dream to come true. When you stepped onto the stage in your enchanting outfit, I almost went crazy with the desire to touch you. But I couldn't approach. I didn't want to ruin everything by disrupting your presentation. I never thought you would notice me in the audience. I was afraid of breaking your life again. You've come so far. Become famous nationwide. There was no room for me in your life. Isabella shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. Career could never replace what I've lost. You've always been everything to me. Oh, Belle, Javier uttered, salty drops rolling down his face. Isabella had never seen him cry before. She held onto him, feeling his body shake with sobs. A forgotten feeling surged anew. She wanted to care for him again, to soothe and comfort his sorrows. What will become of us now? Isabella whispered once Javier had calmed a bit. I don't know. I'm free from them now, but it's not certain. In this business, you can never be 100% sure. I'm afraid it's still not safe for me. Isabella squeezed his hand in distress. I don't care. Life without you doesn't make sense. Javier ran his hand thoughtfully through her hair. Are you sure? Isabella nodded. Javier sighed, pulling her closer and tenderly stroking her hair. Then he kissed Isabella, started the car, and set off on their journey. From that moment on, they never parted ways.